Andrea, it's great to see you again. We met recently over in Koh Samui in Thailand, at a fantastic event for chiropractors. Quite a few from Australia and a couple. But as soon as I was introduced to you, what really stood out was your energy, your enthusiasm, and your passion for really what you do, which is mainly focused around women's health. I thought you'd be perfect for the podcast because it's all about trying to inspire people to inspire themselves. And the message that you've got really is great for a particular niche of the audience, which is obviously the women. I'd like you just to start by maybe saying a little bit about yourself, your background, and what really, really drives you and gets you interested. And then we'll get into today's show.
Okay, happily. Tom, thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to connect with people like you and to, I guess, spread the message of real women's health, far and wide. I guess I got into my obsession with women's health pretty early on, really. And it started with, and I apologize for how graphic this is, but I know that the people who are going to be listening to your podcast are not here for anything that's inauthentic. So we can just dive deep pretty quickly, I assume. So for me, my obsession with women's health started when I was about 10, and my older sister, Sarah, had just got her period for the first time. And I remember waking up one morning to her screaming the house down, and I rushed into her room, like expecting to be fighting off someone who's like trying to murder her. These were the noises that were sort of coming from her room. And I see my older sister lying on the floor on her back, writhing in pain, and literally clawing at her abdomen. And I said to her, Sarah, what are you doing? And her response was literally, I'm trying to pull my ovaries out of her stomach. So Sarah had just had a burst ovarian cyst. And so if any of your listeners had ever experienced that, it can be, pretty traumatic and an incredibly painful process. And so I was this little 10-year-old seeing her go through this thinking, oh my God, is this what I have to look forward to? That was my initiation into periods and hormones and, all of the great things that go with that. And then, fast forward through my teenage years and seeing all of these, all my friends and all of these women suffer because of their hormones. My mum had horrific fibroids. She would have awful, bleeding and hemorrhaging and all sorts of things. And that's sort of what sparked this fascination for me. And I just figured that was normal, that's what women, are supposed to go through. And then if we sort of fast forward to early on in my clinical career, I had a patient that came in that then changed everything for me. Tom, I think I shared this story with you when we were in Koh Samui, is that it's a patient, her name was Stacey, and she had literally the worst case of endometriosis that I guess has been documented. So she would hemorrhage for 10 days a month. She would be hospitalized each time she would get her period. The pain would be so severe that she would lose bowel and bladder control. She would vomit and she would faint. And that was her existence. And she had tried everything. Medicine had absolutely failed her. And she was essentially just told that her options were to have a hysterectomy or just learn to live with it. And that the reason it was happening was because she was unlucky. And that is so true for so many women that come in that have to suffer through the normal biological processes of being a woman. And they're literally told that you're unlucky, you've drawn the short straw, this is the curse of being a woman maybe, and often by, male practitioners. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of what has been my initiation into being completely and utterly obsessed and so passionate about women's health, about women's hormones, fertility, all of that sort of thing. And just knowing that it doesn't have to be that way and that women shouldn't have to suffer.
That's so true. And what I love is, and you haven't finished that story yet, have you? Because that woman was so greater than she was led to believe. Do you want to finish that story off?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I didn't know how much time you would let me sort of divulge into Stacey's story. So thank you for indulging me with that. So Stacey came to see me when she was in her early 30s, and just her suffering was just so beyond anything that I could comprehend. And if we go back through her hormonal health history, it looks a little bit like this. So she got her period at 12. From the moment she started cycling, she was in agony. She would have constant pain. From about ovulation, the pain would build. So she'd have 2 weeks of pain. She would get her period. That would be absolute hell. And then once her period had ended, she'd be lucky if she had maybe 1 good week a month. So she went through every, drug trial you can imagine. She was put on all sorts of different hormonal contraceptives that only made it worse. She was given the Mirena IUD when she was 15 as part of a drug trial. She bled on that every day for 2 years. She was put on tamoxifen, which is a menopause drug that they give to women who have breast cancer. So she was put into essentially chemical menopause as a teenager. She had had 11 different endometrial surgeries by the time she came to see me. When she was in uni, she was having pethidine injections every 3 days just to try and cope with the pain. I can't imagine trying to focus and study with your head just sloshing around in opioids. But these were the options that were available to her. And then by the time she was 21, she was told by the leading gynecological surgeon in New Zealand that the only thing she could do would be to have a full hysterectomy. Wow. So that was her option. So fortunately, she decided that she didn't know whether or not she wanted to go ahead with that. So she chose not to have the hysterectomy and continued to suffer and to sort of somehow manage her symptoms as best she could. And then fast forward about another 10 years or so when she came to see me, and, her existence was pretty miserable. And I definitely felt fairly in over my head. But at the same time, so driven to help this woman because she had literally tried everything. Everything else had failed her. And I was just so determined to at least try and incorporate some really timeless health principles for her. So at least if, nothing changed, I knew that I had done everything I possibly could to try and, improve her quality of life. So when I saw her, we did a really thorough exam. Her health history in itself took 2 hours, which was pretty intense. I had to get her to actually, write a bit of a timeline for me, just because I couldn't keep up with the amount of drug trials and surgeries and, all sorts of different things that she'd done and tried. And to kind of wrap it up in a bit of a long story short, what we started to incorporate was we made some food changes. So we cleaned up her diet a little bit, nothing dramatic. We didn't put her on really big intensive detoxes or anything like that. Just made some, food changes to sort of more of a less inflammatory diet. We talked about her stress levels. I put her on some very basic supplementation and some herbs. And again, nothing crazy. So literally just some adrenal support and some, omegas to reduce a bit of that inflammation. I started doing very specific work with her pelvis and, obviously her reproductive organs as well. And obviously she was under chiropractic care, which was great. And after the first month of care, she still had a 10-day period. She was still in a lot of pain, still taking a lot of medication, still lots of other bodily changes that were happening at the same time, but she wasn't hospitalized. So that was a bit of a win.
Right.
We thought maybe we're onto something. We thought maybe if, even if it could just stay like this, that would be okay. That's an improvement. By the second month, she had a 7-day period. Still very heavy, still very painful, but a little bit improved and a little bit shorter. And then by the third month, she had a 5-day period of no pain. And I will never forget it because she called me and she, in desperation, because she thought that there was something wrong with her. She called me and she said, Andrea, I've just finished my period. It was 5 days. There was no pain. What the hell is wrong with me? Wow. And I had to explain to this woman who is now in her mid-30s that welcome to the world of normal periods. This is what a cycle is supposed to be like. And I think that really hit home for her because she started to do the maths of how much of her life she had lost to the suffering that she had endured. But her story definitely had a happy ending though, because, you know, it's all well and good to have balanced hormones or to have, you know, a healthy body maybe. But in the grand scheme of things, what that really meant for her was that her health had a greater purpose. So she then moved to Cambodia. To work with the Save the Children Foundation over there, which was always something that was part of her, you know, her drive or her purpose. But she was always so terrified to be away from Western medicine. So that is always my wish and my hope for all women, is that their health has a greater purpose and that they don't have to suffer.
I love
and usually the symptoms that they endure or they put up with, that they're told are normal, could be nothing further than the truth. Just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal.
I love that. Just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal. And there's so many things in that story that we can pick out and pull out. But I'm really glad you actually said the whole thing, because it's so inspirational, so many different facets of it. And I think your drive and what you'll come to know as we put information about you on this show and people look into what you do, is it's not just one-offs. It's thousands of women's lives that you're changing through your practice and through your podcast, through your speaking. So I'm super grateful for that.
Thank you.
Is it fair to say one of the reasons this doesn't get highlighted or people do go on to suffer is because it is a taboo subject? People don't like to talk about it. Do you think the stigmas around it affect people's potential to improve? What are your thoughts on that?
I certainly agree with you. I do think that for a really long time it has been quite taboo. Even talking about menstruation and periods and hormones was something that was, you know, very rarely discussed openly. And usually if it was in, you know, hushed reverend tones with maybe your girlfriends, and very rarely, you know, would women even speak to their mothers about this. And I think that is completely pervasive through, you know, the media as well, because if we see, say, advertisements for maybe menstrual hygiene products, they can't even show menstrual blood as a red color. It has to be a very hygienic blue, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that just speaks to the fact that for such a long time, menstruation has been seen, or just hormones in general have been seen as inconvenient, messy, unhygienic. You know, it's just, that's women's business that shouldn't be spoken about. And, you know, I think that there's still cultures around the world that still really segregate women when they are menstruating, for example. And there's very strange, very inhumane, I guess, practices that they still adhere to, which seclude and segregate them when they are menstruating. So I think you're right.
Something in there, you said it's perfectly normal to have a 5-day period with no pain.
Correct.
That is right?
That is absolutely correct. I think this is one of the biggest things that I teach my patients, is that a normal period, normal hormones are no symptoms whatsoever. Wow. So all of the things that we associate with being quote unquote normal, things like maybe women turning into complete monsters for 2 weeks of a month, is completely abnormal. You know, period pain, cramping, really heavy bleeding, bleeding throughout the month or spotting, even starting the period with dark, stagnant blood rather than fresh red blood, spotting before the period happens, kind of like that failure to launch period. You know, mood changes, headaches, breast tenderness, bloating, bowel changes throughout the period, intensive sugar or chocolate cravings. Gosh, the list is as long as, you know, you can imagine. None of those are normal. A normal period is simply 5 days of bleeding. The first 2 are usually heavier. It should taper off to nothing. Average bleed is about 60 mils, which I know is hard to quantify, but just, you know, as a fun fact. And women should experience a change in their system throughout the month, but it shouldn't necessarily be something that's so dramatic where they, you know, might be crying at an Oprah commercial 1 minute and then screaming at their partner the next. You know, all of that is completely abnormal. And that's also true for menopause as well. So often women are taught that menopause is simply a dried up old road to, you know, I guess Alzheimer's and dementia, and then it's all over. Menopause is simply a retrospective diagnosis. It's 12 months without a bleed or without a period. And that's it. It doesn't have to mean hot flushes, loss of libido, cognitive changes, and all those sorts of things.
This is fascinating to me, because as I hear and I think about the story you just said about that lady who started to think about how much of her life she'd missed. And we you know, we're told something's normal. We're told to learn to live with it. It's the curse of being women, as you mentioned earlier. What would be the potential for the females if it didn't take away a week of their month? You know, what difference would it make on their relationships if it didn't become a factor in that? You know, what difference would it make as they move into, as I believe people should move gracefully into aging, without having to be bombarded now by medication, which we know just spirals out of control as soon as we start on maybe HRT or something like that. What is the potential? I'd love to hear your answer on that. What is the potential for women?
Oh, that is such a good question, Tom. And the way I want to answer that is kind of in two parts. So I think the potential for women is limitless. And there is so much evidence that shows that if you want to literally change the world, if you want to end poverty and suffering and, you know, all of those sorts of things, the way to do that, and the thing that's made the most meaningful change, is actually to educate girls and educate women. That has been the one mainstay in every country in the world that has made significant change, is actually empowering and educating women, which I just think is so incredible and really speaks to the fact that I think collectively we do have the ability to really change the world and change our existence. But I think what that also means is, and one thing that I picked up on that you said, that what would happen if we didn't have to lose, you know, 10 days a month or 5 days a month or something like that. And I think that part of what women need to do is actually start honouring their systems a little bit. I think it's absolutely okay to slow down for 5 days a month or 10 days a month or whatever it might be, and work with the ebbs and flows of the hormones and the system and the cycles, because that has always been normal for us, probably up until, you know, maybe the last few centuries, where we really have had that taboo around women's hormones and women's health and periods and those sorts of things. But certainly in ancient times and in tribal times, menstruation was revered. And it was seen as a very deeply spiritual time for a woman. And still now there are tribes where women would moon bathe. So essentially all women in the tribe would menstruate and ovulate together. That's a completely normal thing. It's just a pheromonal change that happens, usually with the full or new moon as well. So they would leave the men for a few days a month. They would spend that time slowing down, nurturing themselves and each other, you know, spending that quality time connecting with their girlfriends. They would meditate, they would, you know, do whatever they need to do. And then they'd come back to the tribe, often with very deep spiritual inflections or messages for the tribe that was respected. Which I think is so amazing. And we can't necessarily, particularly in the Western world, unplug ourselves from our life for 5 days a month. I'm sure a lot of women would love to do that. But what we can do is really honour and respect the ebbs and flows of our hormones and our cycles. And if you're not particularly happy with the, you know, the mood of, say, your wives or your sisters or your girlfriends, then simply wait 2.5 days and it will change, because that's how quickly our hormonal shifts happen as well. Every 72 hours, we have a pulsatile hormonal change. And depending on what phase of our cycle we're in will depend on kind of the responses that you get from us as well. And I think...
Quick it is. Sorry, carry on.
And I think that if women really honour that, they will be able to use that to their advantage. and they'll be able to plan their life accordingly to that as well. So I'm going to crack open a little window right now, if that's okay, into this secret world of women's business, which I don't usually ever allow men to be privy to. And this is something that I teach women all the time. But we do have this privilege of using our cycle to our advantage. And what I mean by that is that around ovulation, so obviously when the egg is being released from the ovary, this is when women are usually at their best. So this is when we are most connected, when we're most articulate. So our words per minute ratio goes up dramatically around that time. We're much more empathetic as well. And I think that is probably for biological reasons. So we are much more understanding when our partners are leaving their, I don't know, maybe their socks on the floor every day, and we're not going to care. We're still happy to, be intimate for obviously baby making purposes. I think that's just an evolutionary shift in our system. We're much more convincing. We are much better at negotiating. So I usually encourage women around this time, if you need to be signing contracts, if you need to be negotiating wages, if you need to be doing really important presentations or sporting activities and those sorts of things, if you have the luxury of scheduling it according to your cycles, then life is going to get so much easier. And I just think it's so fascinating that when women start to actually acknowledge this and tune into it, it's incredible the things that change. They've done some really interesting studies in strippers and weight stuff as well that show that around that ovulatory time is when women get the most tips or they have the most meaningful interactions. And it's because our ability to connect is so different, and our pheromones are so different as well. So we are at this centripetal force, this is when we're essentially irresistible.
I think
that's biology.
I think that's fascinating, and it runs true for men as well, but also both sexes. And when I work with people with stress, timing is so key. So about using the morning when we're in different brainwave states to affect our physiology, and you're talking about to affect your physiology and how you can put out to the world. I love that you said slowing down is okay, because correct me if I'm wrong, and you know way more than me on this, is not slowing down is driving the chronic stress response, which probably is a precursor to a lot of hormonal problems and male issues, but we're talking about female issues here, and you're the expert. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tom, I teach in very simplistic terms. There are 5 S's of hormonal imbalance. And the first one categorically is stress. So just to give you a really quick overview, when we're in that fight or flight response, or when we're pushing too hard, particularly for women, if it's constant and consistent and there's that constant overwhelm or overload, then typically we're producing a lot of cortisol. And I like to say that cortisol is a really bossy hormone. So it will use other hormones to make more and more of it. And obviously our body needs to prioritize that stress response because it thinks that we are running for our lives. So it's part of that self-preserving mechanism that we have. And the first thing that your body will sacrifice is your reproductive hormones. Because when, like baby making, when your body is, theoretically running away from a saber-tooth tiger is a pretty low priority. So your body has the ability to convert progesterone, which is the really key hormone that kicks in the second phase of a woman's cycle, in that luteal phase. And progesterone is what I like to refer to as nature's Valium. So it's a neuroendocrine hormone that calms our system. It has a sedative effect on our body. It's actually more potent than most anxiolytics. So it's more powerful than diazepam on the system. And it totally is a woman's hormonal superhero. But when we're stressed, your body will convert progesterone into cortisol.
Wow.
So just if you want to get really nerdy, it's through a process called the pregnenolone steal, where it is upregulated into cortisol. And cortisol will also compete for receptor sites on cells. So even if we're not converting it into cortisol, cortisol will be bossy and will kick progesterone off, because obviously it's the priority. So just the very first stage of that hormonal stress cycle, you'll have to excuse my dogs barking in the background. It happens every single podcast, don't worry. They just have to make their presence known. It's that very first step in that hormonal stress cycle that then completely throws a woman's cycle out of whack. And the symptoms that women may experience with that, and there's quite a cascade of things that happens after that, but when we have lower progesterone, will always be relative to something else, so relative to estrogen excess. So when that happens, usually we're having much more painful periods, much heavier cramping, heavier bleeding. We might get things like breast tenderness, really severe mood changes, hormonal headaches, and the list goes on.
So
it's classic.
Practically, for women on that one, I bet they're all sitting listening going, I totally feel what you're saying. What can I do? And you mentioned earlier, timeless health principle.
Yes.
What are maybe 3 things that and I know everybody is so different, but what are 3 things women could immediately do to improve their hormones, improve their cycle, and make a greater impact in their lives, for their family?
Oh, 3 things. Oh, Tom, that's so hard because there's so many, aren't there? Okay, so I think in terms of the highest priority of timeless health principles, first thing is you have to address the stresses. So the things that are keeping you awake at night, the things that make your stomach turn over, whatever it is that is creating that anxiety and that stress in a woman's system, and whether or not it is rushing around after children or, not taking a break, maybe prioritizing work over sleep, all of those sorts of things. Stress is completely relative to each person, and it's the way that our system perceives those stresses in the first place. It will depend on how your system actually copes with that. But I think putting in steps to actually cope with the stress in the first place is one of the most important, meaningful things that women can do. It might be starting to say no unapologetically. It might be starting to just simply slow down and not rushing around everywhere. It might be starting a meditative practice, whether or not that's just some parasympathetic breathing. So that breath in for 7, out for 11, in for 7, out for 11 a few times a day. That could be enough to just start to empty off that load a little bit. So definitely managing or addressing the stresses. And it's always the hardest thing to do. The most important is always the hardest. So that is number 1. The second thing is absolutely whole food nutrition. And I know that that's not going to come as a surprise to anybody. That might seem too overly simplistic, but I think there is such grace in simplicity as well. And for women's hormones in particular, our hormones are made up of proteins and fats. So we need really good quality versions of those with each meal. We need to make sure we're eating enough. Hopefully lots of really good fiber, because that's going to help your body to metabolize those hormones really well. It's going to help to upregulate all of our detoxification pathways too. So even just, increasing the amount of fiber that a woman is having is one of the most powerful things that they can do as well. So I like to suggest that they aim for at least 2 cups of vegetables per meal as a starting point, because I don't think any women are really eating enough fiber when we really break it down. So that is whole foods nutrition. And the third thing, I think, it's a bit of a, I'm conflicted here as to what is the priority, because getting rid of the hormonal, synthetic hormonal load on their system is, such a high priority. And then the other thing that I want to mention as well is obviously having a sound nervous system, because that will help them to experience.
Things and 1 bonus then.
1 bonus. Okay, great. All right. So let's talk about having a sound nervous system then. And obviously as chiropractors, this is our bias. We know that you cannot have a truly healthy body unless you have a nervous system that is functioning optimally. And what I find is that often this is the missing link for women, that they can be doing all the right things. They can be meditating. They can be taking really good quality supplementation. They can be eating really good foods. But if their brain can't actually communicate appropriately and regulate how their entire hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal and ovarian axis is working, then like, what's the point? And it also, we know that getting adjusted helps you to experience your world and your stresses so differently as well. So that's always such a priority for me and for my patients. But the last one, and I love that you've allowed me to have a bonus there, is looking at the sources of hormones. And usually the biggest one is oral contraceptives or hormonal contraceptives, which just completely wreak havoc within our systems.
I think they're, and we can open up a whole nother conversation about that in terms of.
That is a podcast all into itself, that's for sure.
It is, isn't it? And I'm not even going to open it up because I'm going to save that for another podcast. Because that'd be a real topic.
Yeah.
I love those principles. They are so simple. And I think maybe the barrier to people actually doing it comes right back to what you said at the start, is common versus normal. Why would you do anything if this is perceived as normal? And, it's normal for me to have pain. It's normal for me to bleed heavily. It's normal for this to last a long time. So why would I do anything? Because it doesn't change what is normal. But what you're saying is couldn't be further from the truth.
And I think that women are starting now to become a little bit more savvy to this. So when I started speaking a few years ago about this, I used to poll the room and I used to ask women to put up their hand if they thought they had a normal cycle. And it used to be that the whole room would put up their hand, and then I'd ask them to put down their hand if they had, and then I would go through a list of symptoms. And then we'd slowly start losing people until the point where no one had their hand up.
Wow.
And the point of that was to show them that what they thought was normal was not necessarily normal. But now when I do this, I'm always so surprised these days that when I ask that same question, it's a much fewer percentage of women that are actually raising their hand, because they're starting to realize that what is common and what is normal are two completely different things, and that maybe they deserve better as well.
Brilliant. I think the world is changing in that way. I think there really is a conscious shift for people to take more ownership, more awareness. And I love the fact that what you do empowers them to actually do that, actually take that control and make it. But I am so blessed to have met you to be able to bring this to our audience. I think that's brilliant.
Thank you.
I really want to do like at least another one, probably another 2 podcasts with you, and just get super specific on some stuff, geek out and totally rip apart the cultural norm. Where can people find out more about you?
My website is drandrea.com.au. I am on Facebook. So my Facebook handle is The Period Whisperer, which I know is weird. That was a nickname that was given to me by one of my patients that now I can't escape from. So I thought I'd try and embrace it. And I'm on Instagram, which is at drandrea.xo. And also the podcast as well that we have. So I'm one half of the Wellness Women, and we have a podcast called Wellness Women Radio. You can find it on iTunes or, whatever podcast medium that you're using. And we usually release weekly, and all of the topics that we cover are, everything, women's health, sometimes men's health as well, but, just general health and lifestyle stuff for women, really. So that's Wellness Women Radio.
And I'll put a link to that, and I think people really should listen to Wellness Women Radio. I've listened to it. It's certainly opened my eyes up and educated me a lot. So thank you very much for everything that you do. You really do change the world, and I mean that. I really mean that.
Thank you.
And I know our audience is going to get so much out of this, and I'm sure they'll be super excited to have you back on the show at another time. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you so much. I am really honoured to be on your show, so thank you.
Thank you. Awesome.
Cool.
Stop recording.